Hello, everyone. I'm Charlotte Anders, and I welcome you on behalf of the Georgia Tech Alumni Association. We're really happy to have you join us for this program today. Some housekeeping: the session will be recorded, and we'll send you a link to the recording on Friday. If you have colleagues or friends who registered and couldn't attend, and if they ask, they will also get the link to the recording on Friday. Your microphones are muted, so if you have questions or comments, which are welcome, please add them to the Q&A section, not the chat. We want to keep them in the Q&A section if at all possible. And we'll answer as many of the questions as possible. Today's webinar topic is reducing fatigue and injury in the workplace. We're very pleased to be collaborating with Georgia Tech Professional Education, the Georgia Manufacturing Extension Partnership, and the Safety, Health, and Environmental Services Group for this program. And to tell you a little more about these partners, I'm turning the mic over to Kelly Pierce, who's the Assistant Director of Marketing for Georgia Tech Professional Education. Kelly?
Thank you, Charlotte. Good afternoon, and thank you to all of you joining us virtually. Georgia Tech Professional Education, we've really enjoyed participating in this career development series with the Alumni Association, and particularly on today's topic. So professional education, as a unit, we represent the global campus and lifetime education arm of the Institute. And we offer a variety of programs that are both online and in person, just designed to meet the needs of working professionals and industry partners in the STEM and business fields. So this includes connecting learners and instructors who are industry experts, like our two panelists today from the Enterprise Innovation Institute, to deliver both courses and certificates that cover the latest topics and advances in manufacturing, quality, occupational safety and health, environment, and more. So we'll share some links to these programs in the chat. So in case you're interested in learning more, you can bookmark those and go back to them later. But I'm going to turn it over now to Cristina Ramos. She's our marketing manager with Georgia Tech Professional Education and a moderator today. So she'll introduce our panelists and get us started.
Thank you, Kelly. And good afternoon, everyone. As Charlotte mentioned, our topic today is Wasted at Work, tips for reducing fatigue and injury in the workplace. And we will be hearing from two expert speakers on this subject. So as Kelly mentioned, please check the chat for helpful links and resources you can peruse after the presentation. If at any time you have questions, please drop them in the Q&A. We'll have our panelists answer them at the end of the presentation. So without further ado, I'm glad to welcome our first speaker, Philip Grayson. Philip is a vice president and senior consultant for ProSafe Solutions. He's a seasoned safety professional and is a certified industrial trainer in construction health and safety technician through the Board of Certified Safety Professionals. Philip is also a certified John Maxwell leadership trainer and coach. He serves as course director and an adjunct faculty for several OSHA Training Institute courses at Georgia Tech. And he also developed and instructs the Foundations of Safety Leadership course. So I'm excited to hear more from Philip. So let's get started.
Okay. All right. Well, thank you, Christina, and thank you, Charlotte. Good afternoon, everyone. We're going to talk about fatigue for a little bit. And yes, any questions you have, happy to answer them and discuss them however you want to. One thing before we get started is that a lot of what I'm sharing with you today comes from culture assessment work. I've been blessed for the past 23 years to do a lot of safety culture assessments with different companies. A lot of them are in the construction industry, chemical refineries, and aggregate plants and things of that nature. And fatigue is something that comes up a lot. The employees talk about it a lot, the supervisors and managers do. And so some of the thoughts I'm sharing with you today come from that perspective of what do all these people think about fatigue when we're addressing it at work. So I'm gonna share my screen and we'll go through some of these things. I love the title Wasted at Work, because really that's what it is that when you put it in perspective, we're hiring a bunch of drunk people. And what I mean by that is that fatigue has the exact same effect on your brain as drinking alcohol. The funny thing is that when someone is drunk on alcohol, you can see the effects physically. They're slurring their words and they're stumbling, and it's hard for them to maintain balance. But with fatigue drunkenness, it's happening more in their mind. So it's a little bit more difficult to spot all that in worker behavior when they are fatigue drunk, but the same thing's going on. And, just looking at some studies from WorkSafe BC, that if you've been 21 hours without sleep, that's the same thing as failing a breathalyzer in the state of Georgia. It's having that same effect on your brain. So it is, when we expect people to make good decisions and problem solve and all of that, they can't do that if they're drunk, but they are drunk. Concentration, attention level, irritability, how motivated they are, all of those are symptoms of fatigue. And, we all want supervisors, workers to make good decisions, but sometimes those bad decisions can lead to catastrophic accidents. And which is why we should look at how is our system contributing to the fatigue and those effects on the human brain. But, here's a great example that when you look around downtown Atlanta right now, it's covered up with tower cranes. And in our region of the country, it's normal for those tower crane operators to be working 14 hours a day. There are some areas of the country that are more union based, and they might have lesser hours in their shift. But in our right to work state that we have down here, we often work people a lot of hours. And when you go to a lot of those construction sites, usually the first person there is the tower crane operator, and they're climbing up to the top. And then they're isolated in that cab for most of the day, and they're usually the last one to leave. And so 14 hours a day is not uncommon. But when you look at just the 14 hours, how far do they live from that job site? And rarely do they have an apartment that's right across the street from it. So maybe they're driving an hour home both ways, and now they're up 16 hours. And if we kind of go back, well, how many hours are they really awake? Because if you've ever really worked a really long day, and I think in many days where I've had to like fly on an airplane, go teach some class, fly back home, you battle getting to your car, and you finally get back to the house and you're wired, and you can't just go straight to sleep. You have to unwind a little bit. You have to stay awake in order to go to sleep. And so you might find that a lot of those tower crane operators are up 21 hours and they're just not getting a lot of sleep. So basically, they're drunk. They're drunk up there. Now, if that same tower crane operator was drunk on alcohol, we would probably fire them. But when they're fatigue drunk, we don't just tolerate it. We actually create the system that causes the fatigue drunkenness, which is why when we look at changing things like fatigue and things that cause error and lead to catastrophic incidents, we should focus primarily on the system that we place people within. Now, for some people, this is a normal concept, and for others, it's not. A lot of fatigue strategies focus on changing the worker. What we need to look at is the system we place the worker in. There's high turnover. People come and go at work. And no matter how much we try to change each individual, sometimes that can be insanity. If you think of the resource intensiveness of trying to change everybody's mind, what is the system we place that worker inside of? And if you go back to the quality movements of the 80s and W. Edwards Deming, he found that most errors were not caused by the individual worker. They were caused by the system you place the worker in. And if you fast forward to the 2000s and you look at the safety work of Sidney Decker, he found the same thing, that most errors, most accidents, all of those things that happen are predominantly based on the system you place someone within, and the worker's not the problem. So that all points us to, if we really want to make major change, the greatest change we could experience would be looking at the system that we place people in, and how does it influence or encourage fatigue to occur. there are legal limits on fatigue. And so when we look at Georgia DOT, that they have limits on how long a driver can drive, but it's based primarily on driving down the road. And 14 hours a day. So we start with the 14-hour rule that you can't drive more than 14 hours a day, but still that's a lot of hours. That doesn't leave a lot of time to go home. And everybody's got stuff to deal with, right? But not only do we have the commute to work and back home, and sometimes people play around with that rule. Are we really considering the commute time when we look at driver hours? And then there's the push. We can push 2 more hours. We can drive 16 hours. And there's a couple caveats that GDOT has on that. Like did you only do it once a week or something like that? But then when we get to 16 hours, we're only left with 8 hours in a day, right? So where's the commute time to and from work? Where's the dealing with your kid's soccer ball or t-ball game or paying the bills and all that stuff we have to do at the house? And so we're not getting 8 hours of sleep. But when we look at those rules, these rules are both good and bad. These rules came from mass fatalities and lawsuits when drivers were allowed to go 21 hours down the road, and there was nothing there to defend against that. And so we had a lot of people die. And then out of all those fatalities is where we got these rules. So they're better than nothing. But are they perfect? No, they're not. They're not. And so one thing I see a lot in the construction industry is that sometimes people will take the DOT regulations and apply them to construction workers. Because all that stuff we just looked at with the Department of Transportation, that's just for driving down the road. And some companies have no rules in place for how many hours we work a worker on the floor in a factory or on a job site. But some do take those 16-hour rule, and they apply it to a job site. And it was kind of interesting. In one of my culture assessments, corporate safety director of a really large organization that's based in North America, she was frustrated with this, that a lot of managers were coming up with a rule that they wouldn't work more than 16 hours doing road construction. But can we really even call that a fatigue management plan when they're probably commuting far away from home to get to this job site, going back home, dealing with all the family stuff and responsibilities we have? And is that really a plan? So anyway, yeah, the DOD just applies to the drivers, but what about everyone else in our industry? So again, we've come a long way with at least having some kind of defenses, but are they really adequate, and is there room for improvement? And yes, there's an interesting study that Caterpillar did at an Australian mine, and they were studying people falling asleep at the wheel in this mine environment. And what they found that there's a lot of people operating heavy equipment, and as they operate heavy equipment, they're working long hours and they fall asleep at the wheel. And so they were calling them micro sleep events. And in the studies, they found that most of the time when people were falling asleep at the wheel, it was somewhere between 2 and 20 seconds. And they had one particular worker, and he was asleep for a little over 9 seconds. And what they found, at 9 seconds, just doing 31 miles per hour, that you could actually cover the length of 9.5 haul trucks. And so how much death and construction could happen during one of those micro sleep events? And I think we all kind of experience that to an extent, where you're riding down the road and you space out for a minute, right? So what's going to happen during those 9.5 seconds? And we could easily kill someone. Another thing I see a lot, primarily in the construction industry, is people wear fatigue like it's a badge of honor. There is this level of pride that some workers experience in how long they've been awake without sleep. And it's kind of funny how human beings are notoriously bad at perceiving risk. If you've ever met that individual that's afraid to fly on an airplane, but is happy to drive, and there's just a great example that humans aren't always the greatest at perceiving risk. And same thing with fatigue, that I see a lot of pride in showing up early, that you have good morals, that you're always at least half an hour early, you stay late to show your dedication to the organization you're working for. And I've met a lot of people that would say that in relation to fatigue, that they were actually prideful that they worked 24 hours straight, but at the same time, they're drunk, right? And so what kind of quality do we see out of the work that they're doing? And so on one hand, you might have a workforce that expresses pride in how many hours they've worked. And a lot of those employees, some of them actually want those hours. They want them because inflation's bad. They want to make money. But what does the employer get in return? When we look at the return on investment, employers are spending a lot of money on fatigue. National Safety Council did a study that employers might spend over $100 billion a year in the health-related lost productivity, that there's a lot of health-related consequences from not getting enough sleep. A lot of times people tend to have poor diets. They eat more junk food when they stay up many hours. They're drinking the energy drinks that are not good for our body, and it costs a lot of money. And at the same time, almost half our workers are sleep deprived. And then the night shift workers, especially, the overwhelming majority are complaining about the loss of sleep, and can lead to other things like drug use and some kind of uppers to keep them going. So it is an expensive problem as well. But in my culture assessment work, that's one of the most common things I hear from management when you bring up the issue of fatigue. What I will hear most often is a manager responds with, "Yeah, but the worker wants those hours." And not all of them do. Now, a lot of times what management hears is maybe a few voices that say, yes, they want those hours, but not everybody's saying that. And so then management takes those few select voices that say that they do want the hours, and they can use that as an excuse to drive a more aggressive schedule. But the issue is yeah, we're going to give them the hours. And one of the safety guys actually said this. He said, yeah, okay, you want the hours, that's fine. Let me give you a loaded weapon and go be safe. That's what we're doing when we give people heavy equipment like excavators and bulldozers or cement trucks. We are giving the worker a loaded weapon, and they're drunk, and telling them to go be careful and pay attention. And so is that really the right thing to do? The other issue with that is, what kind of production are we actually getting? If you've ever done night work in your career, and I have, it's a lot of people standing around doing nothing. I remember this one job, it was a power company, and the power company demanded that a night shift occur. And so was with these electricians, what you would find at night shift, you would find all these electricians up in the cable trays taking a nap. And so it's kind of this expectation that if you go do a job walk, you'll find 20 electricians up in the cable trays taking a nap. Are we really being productive? But, a lot of times, this ties into what a lot of people call the iceberg of ignorance, that the more disconnected management gets from the field, the less they know of what actually goes on in the field. And so a lot of times management might think that we're getting the same level of production when we work a night shift, but are we really? And if we go visit the job and we see a bunch of people sleeping, we're not getting the same numbers out there. Had another one recently, again, another electrician, and One of the workers was telling me it was the same kind of scenario, that they were forced to do a night shift. And so what they would do is they had this big vault they were installing, and the electricians would start taking pillows and put them in their backpacks and bring them to work. And they would go inside this vault and they would sleep. And so they were happy they were getting paid for it, but they weren't actually doing a lot of production. So sometimes and management's not bad in this conversation. Management's not bad. They're doing what they think is right, sometimes with the information they have that may not be extensive enough to know what's really going on out in the field, which requires us to go visit the field and see the realities of work and what's really going on. And are we actually getting the return on our investment? The other thing I see a lot too is people respond to what they hear, but what are they hearing? So yes, some employees state that they do want the hours, but in our culture assessment work, and I've seen a shift over the past decade, that in our culture assessment work, the overwhelming majority of workers want work-life balance. Now, yes, some do like the hours, but the overwhelming majority are complaining about being away from their family. And we've seen a shift in this nation of what is really most important to people. That you kind of go back and working the long hours, all that kind of stuff. Yeah, there was a great desire for that, but quality of life has become so much more important to today's generation. And I see it as extreme as a mental health crisis. That when you look at what kills people more than anything in construction, it's not fall protection and trench collapses and crane collapses and that kind of stuff, it's suicide. And what I'll see a lot is the way it's worded from the frontline worker is, our spouses cheat on us and leave us because we're not at home. And so a lot of those workers actually want more time with their family, but then management might hear something like 2 or 3 voices that say they do want the hours. And the other thing is, what is it that they really want? What they really want is to be able to afford groceries. It's the pay, right? And over the past few years, ever since COVID, we've all seen it, that we've seen a crazy amount of inflation. And so sometimes when a worker says, I want more hours, what they really want is to be able to afford inflation. We've got a client out in Florida, and they looked at this. And so what they did is they started with a blanket pay increase across the entire company of 7%. So they gave a 7% pay increase to everybody. And at the same time, they reduced hours to try to lessen the effects of fatigue. And then about 6 months later, they did one more blanket across the company, 3% pay increase. And the funny thing that they found is they actually increased production by increasing pay and reducing work hours. There's this concept, it's called slow down, speed up. And what it finds is that people get exhausted, that our brain can only do so much in a given amount of time. But when we actually slow down the hours a little bit, people can get more production done in a smaller time frame because of the quality of work that they're doing when they're more alert. This client down in Florida, the other thing that they found, a couple other benefits, is one, they found increased morale. People were happier. And when you tie that to fatigue, irritability is a symptom of fatigue. So by lessening hours, one thing they found is people weren't as cranky out on the job. And then the other thing that they found, another benefit, was job retention, that people weren't leaving the company as often. So they paid the workers more money. They got more work done on shorter schedules. They increased job retention, and they had better morale. But they had to try it to see if that would actually work. And, as I mentioned before, just employees, they know they're tired, but they're also notoriously bad at perceiving risk. And it's funny how your brain works, that you can know you're tired, but you can't always see how bad the effects of fatigue are on your brain at the same time. But the reality of this is we do have a labor shortage, and then the pay scale hasn't exactly risen to that of inflation. And just another safety director comment that I have up on the screen here, that a lot of the clients, the owners that this general contractor is working for, they're all telling them, you've got to have some kind of fatigue management plan. But at the same time, they're ramming these crazy schedules down their throats. And so they're kind of placed in a rock and a hard place, that, okay, so we have to do this long schedule and we can't really change the schedule. But at the same time, we're told to reduce fatigue. And so it's, a lose-lose scenario. So I might say this a couple times, but when you're looking at fatigue, there's two things to consider. One is change the system when you can. And the second is implement defenses when you can't. So sometimes, yes, the answer is we can work people 8 to 10 hours a day and everybody goes home. But sometimes we can't do that. Sometimes we can't change the hours that people work. And so when you can't change the hours, when you can't change the system, what are the defenses we can implement for fatigue? And so I know Paul's going to share some things to implement defenses, and I've got a couple I might share with you as well. One thing to consider is this, that changing the system is always more effective. Implementing defenses when you can't change it is definitely going to be weaker, but it's better than doing nothing. And sometimes that's the reality of work and the best we can do. So we always want to start with that. Change the system when you can, implement defenses when you can. When I was asked to do this talk, and a lot of what I see in my own company and the work we do, is so much of the fatigue management stuff out there is focused on educating the worker, telling the worker how to get a good night's sleep, telling the worker what a good diet is and how it relates to sleep, telling the worker not to drink energy drinks and all that kind of stuff. But again, management creates that system that workers have to live and survive inside of. So when we're out there trying to educate the worker, that's a good thing. It is definitely a good thing to educate workers on what quality sleep looks like, not having the TV going, not playing video games right before you go to bed. All that stuff is good, but how effective is it when we can change the system that the worker lives inside of? It's longer lasting and it takes less effort. As people come and go, and think about a job site in construction. There are different trades coming and going all throughout years of a project, different crews coming and going. The time investment to change every single mind coming in and out of there is pretty much impossible. But if you can change that system that worker is coming in and out of all the time, then you always will have more productive results. So as we move forward in managing fatigue, we should always focus on that system more than the worker. Again, it's good to train people, but what is that system that they're trying to survive inside of? And different industries might view this differently, but I see a lot of fatigue myths out there that one is just something you can muscle through, that just toughen up and you can get through it. Slap yourself in the face a few times and you're going to be fine. Or like I was just talking about, that fatigue is a personal responsibility. It's not a personal responsibility if we're working someone 14 hours a day. That's a management system that we are placing that worker inside of. Fatigue is inevitable. Maybe. I mean, have we really tried? And again, some clients, it's a select few who have chosen less aggressive schedules, have actually found greater production and increased profit. So it's not like we always have to do it that way. The fourth one is one that we're just different here in America. Some other countries, you go to Europe and other places, they actually take a siesta, right? And so some people just think it's crazy to have napping going on in the workplace. I've got a friend that studies fatigue. She's actually really good at this talk, but she was talking about General Dynamics, works for the military, builds airplanes and tanks and some of that kind of stuff, and how they would have a lot of engineers that had to have long shifts, but they would actually give them an hour to go out to their car to take a nap. And again, they found that they had less errors and greater increased production by giving them a nap. So it might be a little bit more unusual in this country, but it is something that we could do. And the other one, everyone has enough time off for recovery. What is recovery? That, some people work 6 hours, 6 days a week, or some even 7, they take an hour off. And are we really giving people enough time off for recovery? Or is somebody working, let's say 6 days off, 6 days during the week, and they only have 1 day off, and that's where all the family stuff happens, right? The little projects around the house, the yard work, all those things, the washing the hampers full of clothes, and they're dealing with their personal responsibilities. And are they really taking that 1 day to recover, or are they spending it with their kids and all of that? So, are we thinking those things? So let's look at changing the system. Again, teaching the worker is fine, but what is our workplace fatigue management system on developing leadership? And so one, we should definitely educate all the leaders, the supervisors, the managers, on how to recognize signs of fatigue. Are they blinking their eyes a lot? Because again, they're not stumbling like alcohol drunkenness, but they might be blinking the eyes a lot. They might be more irritable. Can we recognize those symptoms? And then what are we going to do about it? What are we going to do about it that upper management will support? So when a supervisor is out there in the field, out on the floor, and they recognize someone is too fatigued to work, do they send them home, or are they going to have an accident on the way home? And should we have someone else drive them back home? And is management willing to support that effort? Are they going to pay that worker to go home because they're too fatigued? Or is that worker going to lose pay that day? Are we going to pay them to do a lighter, less risky job today? And will management support that? So if we're going to focus on people, we should focus on those who lead the worker and make sure that they know what management will support, not just to recognize signs of fatigue, but what management will support when they see that and what to do about it. You can't regulate the sun. At the end of the day, it's the sun that decides when we should be asleep and when we should be awake. And it's just kind of ironic that we are doing a webinar on fatigue when we're all fatigued in here right now, that the sun and our bodies are pretty much telling us through that circadian rhythm that we should be napping. Maybe some of you are, right? But when you think about between the hours of 1 to 3 p.m., most people, your body is telling you that you should be taking a nap. We tend to be most alert between 6 a.m. and 10, or at 9:30 a.m. and 11:30 a.m., or that 6 p.m. to 10 p.m. region. So what can we do about that? If we can't change the system, can we change where high risk activity takes place? So, maybe you have to do lockout, tag out, or you have a confined space entry, or some critical lift with a crane, or the jumping the tower crane where they erect it and take it up further. If you think of what are those tasks that workers do that require good problem solving, good decision making, and if they make poor decisions, the results will be catastrophic. Can we at least schedule them at hours where our circadian rhythm will support making better decisions? So do we really have to do the lockout tag out at 2 p.m.? We shouldn't do that. And we should also educate management on how they plan things, and are they considering the circadian rhythm as they plan high risk activities? So change the system, right? Change the system where you can, implement defenses when you can't. Maybe it's how we schedule work. Then consider automation, which I'm sure Paul's going to give us some great examples on. There's a lot of technology with wearables today, and I'll show you an example of that are another defense against an imperfect system, and of course, how we schedule work. You know, we shouldn't assign permanent night shift, but I should also give the disclaimer that rotating people back and forth between night and days can actually be worse than that. So if I have the ability to do a temporary night shift for a short period of time and then go back to days, that would be better. But if I can't do that, I definitely don't want to rotate people back from days to nights constantly, because that would actually be worse than a permanent night shift. But just something to consider when we're thinking about who's working what shift. Again, sometimes we're going to have to work more than 12 hours, but do I consider trying to shoot for 8 to 10, and definitely no more than 12 if feasible. And then if I can't do those things, what's the recovery time between shifts? Is it just one day? Can I give somebody 3 days? Can I do the 4 12s and give people some adequate recovery time? And then what can I do to give breaks between shifts? And as insane as it might sound, could we even consider giving people an ability to take a nap if they had to? So one really neat thing going on right now, Caterpillar, and a lot of this, that same study that I was showing you earlier about the micro sleep events, they implemented wearables. And so there are a couple things. One, for the worker itself, for the driver, through video recognition, it would notice them shutting their eyes. And if they were shutting their eyes, it'd give them an audible or a vibration to help wake them up. Again, not perfect. We don't want them fatigued, but something to wake them up if it detected fatigue-based behaviors. The other thing it would do, it said through video monitoring, they could notify management that they had a fatigued worker out on the job. And so what Caterpillar found in this study is they reduced incidents by 94%, which is pretty amazing when you think about it. So wearables, definitely a great technology out there that we could consider. And as we're considering these things, what's the commute look like? Where's that person live in relation to where they go to work? And do we think about that in their total shift? The other thing is, where is their duty and where are different workers working and where are they going? So in the construction industry, here's a complaint I see from a lot of people that I live in Carrollton, Georgia, and there's a project in Carrollton, Georgia, and they send me up to Alpharetta and I got to fight traffic on 400. And then there's another worker that works in Alpharetta and they're sending them down to Carrollton. So can we consider who we're sending where based on where they live as part of how we manage fatigue with the commute? And so just before I turn it over to Paul, one thing I want to share with you is over on the West Coast, we've got this client. And so they really wanted to work on this. And, with all change, every time we change culture, there's an emotional element to change. When you get down to it and you think about how your brain works, when you ask management to change their culture of how they do work, most people interpret change as pain in the brain. And there's an emotional element with that. So I want to talk a little bit about that. Number one, they were afraid to do it. When there was a lot of biting the lip and fingers crossed when they were thinking about reducing hours, that they were going to lose a bunch of money. And so if I know we got a lot of different people from different organizations here, but if your job is to deliver the message to management, showing them data on the return of investment of slowing down, how it can increase profit might be the language you want to use, because they will be afraid to make the change. But so they were afraid. They tried it out. They cut back weekend work. They shortened hours where it was possible. It's road building. Sometimes they had to work long hours. Some things they did is they paid more for hotels to have people sleep in the hotel so they would not have the long commute time, to give them more hours of sleep. They did a lot of redistribution of different duties, and then they did add some automation. And again, what they found was, one, they increased production, they increased profit, they had less errors that could lead to incidents, and of course, they increased worker morale through that process. So it was a success story, but I have to reinforce, it all started with fear that we're going to lose a bunch of money. And that's normal for management to go through that emotional element when you try these things. So that's what I've got right there. I really appreciate that. And hopefully I got some questions in the Q&A, but Paul, I'm going to turn it over to you, unless Christina, you got something for me.
Thank you, Paul. Thank you, Phil. I'm sorry. Okay. That was great information that could be helpful to many organizations. And remember, if you do have any questions, just drop them in the Q&A. We'll get to them at the end of the presentation. So let's move on to our next speaker, Paul Todd. Paul leads the Georgia Manufacturing Extension Partnership Operational Excellence Team at Georgia Tech. Now, that's a mouthful, so we call it Georgia MEP for short. So in addition to that, he assists companies with the application of lean principles, process improvement tools, and change management through workshops, Kaizen events, and shop floor coaching. Paul's expertise lies in lean manufacturing, plant management, leadership development, cultural change, and problem solving. So let's hear more from Paul.
Thank you very much, Christina. Thank you, Philip. I learned a lot from that. So I'm glad I was part of this. I wanted to share my favorite safety picture from the good old days. If you've ever been frustrated with OSHA or MSHA or DOT or anybody with imposing rules you don't think are fair, Philip's right. Most safety rules as we know them were born out of tragedy. And so this picture is from 1909 in Macon, Georgia. It's pretty famous, and it's right down the street from where I live. So the good old days weren't always as good. So I'm going to replicate some of what Philip talked about, and where he talked about change the system. I'm going to talk about change the process design, or the design of the area that you're working in. And I will talk about automation as a way to fix some of the problems or avoid some of the hazards that are out there. Just a brief thing to let you know where we come from at the MEP. We're a federally and state funded program to work with manufacturers of all types. So my stories are not from construction, but usually from manufacturers, and I'll throw in some office things as well. What we're trying to do is help companies get better at whatever it is they do, so they can continue to grow and prosper and improve the economic well-being of the state. So that's our plan. Just a little bit on what the hazard and fatigue issue looks like in different environments. So if you're one of these gentlemen on the left, your hazards are pretty clear in a manufacturing setting. They're using tools, they may be lifting, they may be subject to heat. This is a picture I'm familiar with. This plant is in Athens. It's a great facility. You see they've got some protective equipment, and they likely need that depending on the environment that they're in. The fatigue factor is pretty straightforward as well. They may have physical fatigue in the sense that they're going to be exerting themselves over the course of the day and lifting and bending and holding and so forth. They're also going to be subjected to the mental fatigue of potentially in some positions, the risk is of boredom, of repetition, of a lack of variety, a lack of mental stimulation once they get good at their job and do what they do. Depending on the job, that can be a risk. Those are relatively easy to see. Now, the guy on the right, in comparison, he's got a great situation. He's in a climate-controlled facility. He's got lots of natural light out this beautiful window. He must be a big shot. He's probably got a good chair. He's got modern equipment. He's very unlikely, and if you work in an office, you're very unlikely to get hit by a forklift or something like that, or have something fall on you, or fall off a ladder, or have a chemical spill, or something that's more tragic like that. His risks are much more subtle, and physically they involve things like back strain and eye strain, those types of things, which accumulate over time. Nobody has a typically a tragic incident, and now in an office they have a back strain, but years of sitting in a bad chair or bad posture, whatever it might be, eye strain from looking at computers and other devices hour after hour. He also suffers from the same hazard of fatigue as his counterparts on the left. Boredom, repetition, a lack of variety, sameness, a lack of stimulation, unfulfilling work, all of those things can lead to a sense of fatigue in terms of mental fatigue that really just grinds us down over time and leads to some of the same types of incidents that Philip talked about. So just think about your own situation. I think one of the things we're really still thinking about is what the remote world looks like in terms of how we work. One reason people are so reluctant to come back to a traditional office setting is they figured out that they can get a lot of work done without being in an office full of people. Now, there's some risks to that too. There's isolation and other things, but we've learned a lot about what you can do productively outside of a traditional office setting. And so there's a lot of companies trying to understand what is the right balance between those two things. So let's talk about the first big thing, and I'll talk about these in a very specific order. Please don't automate things that may or may not have been evaluated in terms of whether it's a good process. So process design, evaluating a process for effectiveness and safety is the critical first piece before you do any automation, whether you're in an office or a manufacturing facility. And this is what I do and my team does routinely, is help companies learn this skill of examining a process and making it better. The key things I want to bring out is grasping the situation in our language just means understand the process before you begin to change it. Before you make changes that may or may not make the process better, understand the current process. And I'm going to steal the iceberg of ignorance from Philip. I love that one because that is a great term for something that is endemic to any organization, especially the larger you get, the more remote you get. What you think is happening is probably not what's actually happening. And from there, it's the plan, do, check, act cycle in reality. So you're taking the scientific method and applying it to a process to understand, based on the observations that I have, and I've talked to the people who do the work, what can we do differently? That's our plan. We're going to go create an experiment to see what we can do differently, check the results of that experiment, and then build that new knowledge into the current workplace. In this case, we're trying to reduce or minimize the hazards that lead to physical or mental injury and fatigue. The key part I want to mention here is that traditionally, this might have been done by a talented, qualified industrial engineer or a safety manager. Those people are great. They're key to the process, but I want to emphasize the absolute necessity to involve the people doing the work in that process design. They are the ones who understand it, and they are the ones that are going to have to live with it. So it's really critical that they be involved in the brainstorming, the setting up of these experiments, the carrying out of the changes and whether they work or they're not going to work. And the way to start that conversation is just my question there at the end. What would it take to make your particular job or the jobs in your area better, being easier, safer, more fulfilling, whatever it might be? They're going to have the right answers to those questions and the ones that are going to be implemented most effectively. Only after you've done that part should you begin to think about automation, whether in an office or a factory. Any good software person or factory automation person will tell you that it is possible to computerize or automate almost everything. The question is, what should you do? How should you do it? Does it make economic sense? Is this a good application for you? Because there's somebody out there, there's a vendor out there that will sell you a wonderful package that will do great things. But what you may be doing is automating a bad process and producing bad results faster and more efficiently. And that's not what we're after. So the classic test of whether a process should be automated has been and still remains, is this thing dull, dirty, or dangerous? And that's where we get good applications for automation. So if you're in an office, it's probably going to be a software process or software application of some type, and new and better computers and tablets and other things that are coming out, and whether that's augmented intelligence or something else. The picture on the left there, that's an old-fashioned factory, an office as a factory. So offices at one time were just factories that produce documents. And so over time, we've developed a lot of automation tools in the plant or in the office to alleviate that. Most of those have been about speed and cost reduction. And that's a good thing, but we also need to look at those in terms of, can we take this horrible task that we've asked people to do and relieve them of that burden? Is there a piece of software or a device of some kind that will take over that drudgery so that they can be put to use doing much more fulfilling and useful things that only a talented human can do? That's a good test of office automation is this burden something that we can take away? If you're in a factory, the picture on the right is pretty typical of a modern automotive plant. The portion of the plant that involves assembling and welding the body itself is going to be highly automated. Lots of expensive and amazing robots. What you won't see in a picture like that is any people, because it would be extremely dangerous for a human to be anywhere near those robots. And there are cages and safety curtains and light curtains and everything else that are keeping people away. Once you get into the later stages, you'll see lots of people involved in car making. But so that's a typical application of robotics in a factory setting, and a very good one. But I want you to think beyond that. If you don't have a situation like that, this is very expensive. First of all, of course, it's highly capital intensive. Think about cobots or collaborative robots, and I'll add one picture here. This is a very small device which does equally repetitive and mundane things that a human could do, but is not a good use of that person's talents. The difference is there's no safety cage around here because they don't need one. These robots are designed to do work that is compatible with humans, and they are not strong enough. Whereas the previous robots, they're hydraulic and electronic, and they will bend metal and crush an arm equally easily. These cobots are designed to be safe in the sense that they don't have the power to do that. They can be overridden by human interaction in an emergency. So that's why they're more effective. So the message is, if you thought of robotics as that first picture, and that's way beyond the scope of what you could and should do and is economically feasible, think again about the newer opportunities in less robust and more appropriate robots in the form of collaborative robots. And think about best practices like these, and I'll ask you to put these in the chat, anything that you are already using. If you're in an office, pay attention to the ergonomics of how people work and the cumulative effect on bodies of that type of work. In a plant, there's lots more things that are useful for lifting aids and so forth. Social programs and wellness programs are not just how to be nice to people and retain people in a very competitive job environment. They are definitely that. But think about how people feel mentally and physically about their workplace. And if you're working alone, isolation is part of a wellness program. What do you do to alleviate that? How do you bring people together in some form so that they're feeling that they're part of a team? Certainly, if you can't get rid of a strain or a difficult task, is there a way to rotate jobs so that at every break you go do a different part of the job so that somebody else is in that position? You're not bending the same muscles and joints hour after hour, day after day. And I've been in stretching programs like the one in the picture. That used to be kind of a weird hippie kind of thing in years past, but most of the good companies that I know of that involve the danger of repetitive motion or bodily strain do that. And that's very useful in an office setting as well as a plant setting. So you can do yoga programs and things like that in a work setting, and it works really well. So here's what I would ask each of you to do. I hope you've learned something, especially from Philip, but also just think about any training that we go through. One of the questions that we ask is, how is this going to be useful? What should the people sitting in this webinar do with this information? So I will challenge you that if you are directing the work of others in some form, go talk to them. Have conversations about how they feel physically and mentally, and what's the source of their pain and suffering, if there is some that you can identify. Your goal, of course, is to reduce or eliminate those hazards, and I'd ask you to work together with those people, your team or your colleagues or whoever it might be, to find solutions to those, collaborate to minimize those hazards. And if you're working on your own, you're in an office or you're a team of one, you're in your office is your kitchen table, same process applies. What are the hazards in your own unique workplace that cause you mental and physical anguish and cause a hazard to your health? And what can you do to experiment your way forward? Do something is the key. Do something within the bounds of safety to try something different and see what works for you. How can you alleviate some of the things that are causing you grief? And so I'm going to stop there, and you'll get happy to share any of these slides that anybody's interested in. If I can be of any help to you, or my colleagues can, that's what I'd ask you to do is just let us know, and we'd be happy to talk about it. And I know lots of smart people now, including Philip, who I didn't meet until this event. So I'm very happy about that. So I'm going to stop sharing there. If there are questions or comments, I'd love to hear them, and we'll see what happens.
So do we have any questions that you'd like to add to the Q&A?
So we don't currently have any questions in the Q&A.
Right. So it looks like you guys covered everything. So we don't have questions, and that's great. Paul, I believe you had something that you wanted to close down this session with.
If we had time, I will share one more thing for a Georgia Tech audience. It's a quick story about one of the ways that you engage people is to give them a sense of purpose. And when we talk about having these conversations with people and trying to make your workplace better, that's a critical factor. It's not something that can be dictated. So having people engaged is a critical part of that. This is a picture some of you might recognize. It's taken a few years ago of the green space in front of the Georgia Tech administration building. That's North Avenue is crossing in front of the picture there. Now, unfortunately, the big tree on the left is no longer there. That one had to be cut down because it was diseased a few years ago. My story involves a former executive vice provost for research named Steve Cross. Dr. Cross was crossing this green and told this story as just coincidence, but when I took this picture, there was a grounds crew maintaining that spot and putting in flowers or trimming or doing something. And Dr. Cross stopped the team leader and he said, "Hey, this looks great. I just want to thank you for all the excellent work you and your team are doing." That's lesson one. Is it's great when senior people notice and appreciate the work of people in lower level positions, very unglamorous jobs in some cases, but they've got to be done. But even better, the better lesson was the response from the team leader of the landscape crew. He said, "Well, thank you. So we try to make sure we take extra special care of this space because this is the first place at Georgia Tech that prospective students and their parents see." He's exactly right. The parking lot across the street is where prospective students coming for a tour of Georgia Tech are told to park. They and their parents then walk across this green to get to the building where they're going through their tour. So the lesson for me was everybody has a role to play in the mission of the organization. What does the grounds crew have to do with advancing the mission of Georgia Tech? They know that they have a role to play in attracting the best and brightest students to Georgia Tech. So if they can do it, the rest of us can do it. So I think when you're trying to build a culture of safety and awareness of hazards and how to make it better, it's really critical that you keep people involved.
That was great. Thanks, Philip and Paul. This was great information. Really enjoyed it. I'm sure everyone else did. And thanks to all of you who did join us today live. Just a reminder, there will be a email on Friday with a link to the recording. You'll also get an evaluation survey, and we really encourage you to do that and provide us information because I do look at them and we do try to make improvements based on your suggestions. So it's always wonderful to hear from you. So want to be mindful of everyone's time, and we're going to close it down. And thanks again to everyone. Have a great rest of your day.
Everybody.
Yes.